we need to go back in time a little bit, starting 56 million years ago, when the oaks arose. And oaks are one of the most diverse, abundant, important woody plant groups to the ecology of the northern hemisphere. We have more than 500 species of quercus. And it's amazing to see some of these oak fossils going back to between 5 to 2.6 million years ago, looking like this, and amazing how similar it is to what we see today. And of course, all these species connected to oaks has a very long evolutionary history then. A little bit more recent history then, 100,000 years back in time now. What kind of landscape has the species evolved in? You're probably aware of that there's quite some debate of how open was the old landscape. But there are some new data coming in showing that maybe it was semi-open or open to quite a large extent. So in this study they have looked on subfossils of dung beetles, and looking at the last interglacial before humans arrived to Europe, we have quite a lot of high dung, as they called it here. That's a high diversity of dung beetles connected to open areas. And that corresponds to wood pasture, semi-closed forest, and we have also some closed forest. What happened when we entered the scene is that most of the large mega herbivores disappeared, and we had quite a lot of closed forest. But then after we started with agriculture, meadows and all these kind of things, we are sort of back again to this semi-open landscape to quite a large extent. As you can see here, it's quite similar between the last interglacial and what we had, at least. And of course this is important for conservation of oak-dependent fauna and flora. Because sun-exposed oaks seem to harbor the richest communities if you look into the research. Richness of lichens on ancient oaks in open conditions was on average 47% higher than on oaks in secondary woodlands when they are shaded. Another important thing when it comes to management of individual oaks is that the majority of the oaks is on the lowest 2 meter of the trunk. So the majority of these oak-dependent species is on the lowest 2 meter. More than 69% of the total abundance was in this part of the trunk. And that has, of course, implications. Try to avoid shading by hazel or second overgrowth if you want to keep a rich oak lichen flora. Going on to, I need to mention, of course, that you have a few lichen species that are shade-loving also, Artonia bisacea, for example. There are some species, but the majority like sun. The same goes for beetles. This is a study made from several different sites, and you have the shade on this axis here and the number of species of saproxylic beetles here. And as you can see, the majority of the sites with increasing shade, the number of species goes down here. And another study by Niklas and Thomas Ranius also show the same things here. Only one single species out of 68 had a greater frequency of occurrence in stands with high original canopy cover. There's a shaded forest then. And this is hollow oak dependent species. So sun-loving individuals. Probably goes back to the evolutionary history here. One thing to think about is that old oaks subjected to second growth might produce a little bit more of fruiting bodies, so of fungi. So these kind of beetles might be benefiting from a little bit of shade. But in general, they love the sun. And if we want old oaks, we need some regeneration of oaks also. And if we want sunny areas, we need grazing. So what happens if we add these fellows here? Then the oak seedlings need some protection. And it seems like the protection from thorny bushes is the best protection they have. We made some really interesting studies around the oak seedling density in different types of oak areas. This is a dark, ungrazed area full of second growth. And as you can see here, the number of oak seedling is very low, both outside thorny bushes and in thorny bushes. In dark areas, we have no oak regeneration at all. If we have a sun-exposed, ungrazed area, outside thorny bushes, we have some oak seedlings. In thorny bushes, much better. But the largest effect we have on sun-exposed grazed areas. Very few outside thorny bushes, but a very good regeneration inside thorny bushes. So these are really key to the future of old oaks then. And the thorny bushes themselves has a quite interesting ecology also then. This is the canopy cover overall on the site. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of thorny bushes. When you have a low canopy cover here, less than 20%. But when you go up above 60% canopy cover, the thorny bushes dies themselves. And that also makes it difficult, of course, for oak regeneration then. And of course, we have to mention these old trees. Anna mentioned that already, that we have an enormous amount of microhabitats that accumulates with age then. Fungi, we have white rot, we have brown rot, wood mold in hollows, dead wood in branches, dead wood in roots, water-filled hollows with their own fauna, deep crevices, changing bark structure, and so on and so on. And when they get as old as this one, 1050 years old, you have quite a lot of niches here then. And as she mentioned also, oaks up here in Sweden has the highest richness of all Swedish trees. If you combine the host-specific and the 900 other species that utilize oak then. So all of these fellows that we'll hear more about during the conference, and some of them we'll see out in the field also. I want to add one species to this list also that they haven't mentioned around these 900 host-specific or 900 other species, and that's this one. So I hope we will enjoy the coming days here also. How many years does it take for an oak then to become suitable for really demanding species? This is a study of 8 different lichen species. You have 0 to 100 years here, 100 to 200, 200 to 300, or 300 to 480. That was the oldest oak in this study. So some of these species, they only need oaks that are approximately 100 years old. But as you can see, we have a number of species down here, Schismatoma decolorans and Sclerophora conifera, that needs oaks that are at least 300 years old. And again, also this study showed that the majority of these species has an optimum on trees in sunny to intermediate light conditions. So it requires quite a lot of planning if we want to have a functional oak landscape here. The interesting thing is also that some of these prefer the north-facing part of the trunk, or others the south-facing part of the trunk. Some of them inside the crevices, and some of the outer part of the crevices. So it's quite a lot of niches on these huge old oaks. And as I said, it's a long delivery time here. And here is a study that I looked upon what happens with oak-dependent lichens in a landscape where oak stands become overgrown and the regeneration of oaks starts to decline then. Right, so we have an oak-rich landscape from the beginning. Actually, it started 100 years before this graph here with a very low oak regeneration, only 10%. So what will happen with these species, of course, with a continuous low regeneration rate, we will continue to lose suitable trees. This is the interesting thing, of course. Let's say we fix this to a normal regeneration rate again. What happens then? Well, takes some time. Takes 100 years before we reach the bottom for many species, and it takes approximately 300 years to come back to previous distribution. So we need to act now if we want to really reach some results. And this is important to think about here is that this is results from an oak-rich landscape. Imagine that this is an oak-poor landscape. We have maybe 100 years before we have the extinctions also. So we need to think ahead. The same thing is if we want to have hollow oaks, of course. It takes approximately 200 years before we have a hollow oak, a hollow to develop here. We'll hear more about how to bridge this gap later. How many? So starting up now with trying to answer the question of how many oaks do different organisms need. This is one study showing that the presence per tree increases with the number of hollow trees in a stand. And this is up to 97 here. So Osmoderma eremita has a 20% probability in a small stand. But Tenebriopacus, they need stands that are almost 100 hollow tree stands. So this gives a little bit of a clue how many they need. So at least around 20 trees. Then it starts to happen things with the really demanding species. So why do they need so many oaks then? One reason is of course that all hollow oaks are different. And we have some interesting studies from Jonas. You can ask him more about this later. They looked in 32 trees for hermit beetles, and it was only 2 trees among these that harbored 45% of the total population of hermit beetles. So that's quite interesting. Imagine you have a stand of just 15 hollow oaks. It's a large probability that none of these trees is a really good habitat, of course. So that's one of the reasons why we need at least 20 to 30 hollow oaks. And I just need to mention one of the species that we have made some calculations how much they need. The top of the top, the orange polypore that I think is present in Tinnerö at least. Anders, where are you? There you are. Yes, it is. And Åtvidsnäs, I don't know. But this is really top of the top. 66 oaks above 150 centimeters in diameter within 25 square kilometers. The recent history, now we are getting closer. Oaks were protected already 1347 in the country law, was Magnus Eriksson. Gustav Vasa adds the so-called regalrätten. All oaks except on noble land were declared to be the property of the Swedish state. The result, all the landowners hated oaks. You should hate young oaks and noblemen, was a saying from this period of time. There were nationwide service of oaks already done. And then the parliament decided in 1830 to recommend that the government should surrender the royal oaks against a small redemption fee for each farm. And then the cutting started. 1875, all farmers owned their old oaks then. And that results in the recent history looking like this. This is a map from the 18th century showing the oak areas. And today the same area looks like this. Heavily fragmented, even though this is quite good anyway, of course, but it's heavily fragmented, and we have lost, at least here in Östergötland, approximately 75% of the old oak areas. Even though that we are in the heart of the oak landscape, we still have lost approximately 75%. How much do demanding species need on the landscape level then, if we step up from the stand level up to the landscape level? So how large oak areas do we need to work with? We tried to answer that question, and Östergötland was a good study area because all these large deciduous trees that has been mapped here. So we had a good starting material, and we have a good species to study also, Elater ferruginus. It's a hollow tree specialist and predator. Predator on Osmoderma eremita, the hermit beetle. This species was originally really difficult to sample with traditional sampling methods like window traps or these kind of things. But after discovery of this female sex pheromone, the species could be served super effectively and quite cheap. So we realized now it was possible to cover a quite large area with a reasonable amount of field work. So out with 224 traps in the landscape. So we did something we called the systematic trapping, just putting traps all over the landscape, wherever. And then we did some strategic trapping also in some of the hot spots and in some of the really low quality areas. So we had quite a good cover of different types of landscapes here. And the idea here was that we put one trap in the oak landscape, and of course asking how many oaks and then what scale. So we started to, around each trap we counted how many old oaks it was, and in different spatial scales like this. So different spatial scales and number of trees at each scale, because we are of course interested in, do they respond to number of trees within 100 meters, 200 meters, or maybe 1 kilometer? We didn't know. So that's first result. What scale do they respond to? It seems like they responded both to the number of oaks within 300 meters around, approximately at the stand scale, but they also responded to around 4.5 kilometers around. And with these predictions, we could also count the number of oaks that they needed here. So now it started to get really interesting then. So these guys, they needed 750 old oaks within 4.5 kilometers for a stand to have a more than 50% probability of occurrence. And what we did here also, we used one of these data sets to predict the other result of the other data set. So we tried to make a prediction here. With the systematic trapping, we tried to predict the rest of the trapping data set. And the good thing here is that we approximately had 80% correct predictions. So this is a really good tool if you want to look upon your landscape, how suitable it is for this species. So we made pretty good predictions of this, and you see that the majority of the landscape is white without any oaks at all, and only a few places were suitable, but we had a very good rate of predicting it correctly here. Of course, again, this question, why do they then need so many oaks in a stand, and why do they need so many patches, such a large landscape? So let's go to another species, Tenebri opacus. opacus. They show the same pattern. You remember they respond to oaks within 90 meters and 850. And this one is a non-flying species, so it responds to a much smaller spatial scale. Requires 6 large oaks in a small stand. So this is one of the most demanding species. But then we have another peak here within 850 meters then. Again, you can make these type of predictions from the landscape. As you can see, most of the landscape is totally white. It's not suitable at all. But what we have here is these gray areas is the larger scale, and these black areas is the suitable on the stand level. So this would be one perfect area for them. This has enough oaks on the landscape scale, but not enough oaks on the stand scale. So trying to understand how this works then is that this is on the stand level. You have them in some trees, they die out from stochastic reasons, occupy another tree and so on, and this goes on over time. But over time, it might be that this specific stand, of course, might be of low quality. Then you need more stands. So they can jump around between the stands, that at least one of these stands is suitable over time. And now we're talking about 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, and then the dynamics works like this. So this is what we think is the reason for them to require such large amount of oak areas. And we think this is in general for many species that are oak dependent here. For the middle-spotted woodpecker, we did another approach. We just looked at successful breeding attempts for them. And we could see that they need oak patches with more than 5 hectares or oak areas with 5 hectares within 10 hectares. Otherwise, they don't use it at all. But again, for breeding, for successful breeding, they needed at least 50 hectares within 500 hectares, but 125, more than 125, they had 100% successful breeding attempts. So we did a check on the landscape here in Östergötland, and we could see that we have total oak area here, 100% of the oak area. If we take away all the oak areas that is less than 5 hectares, we are down here. We have 60% of the oak areas left then. But if we also take into consideration this larger scale, that at least 125 hectares, then we are down to almost 0. Middle-spotted woodpecker is extinct here in Sweden. We lost it in 1982, and we see the reason why here now. Another thing that affects the species is the landscape history also, the recent landscape history. And we have very good maps, and we had oak surveys also, people counting the oaks all over the landscape. And amazing is that connectivity between oaks can explain lichen occurrence better than current distribution of oaks in some areas. So here is a study where they looked upon oak densities 1830 and 2009, and they selected areas where oak density has declined very drastically. And as I said, connectivity of the trees in 1830 better explained the occurrence of all species of lichens in this study. So going back to old records could be really useful when you work with conservation also then. And of course, the species were not in equilibrium with the present day landscape structure. That gives us also an opportunity, of course, because we are waiting for them to go extinct in these areas, but we can also save them because we have this window in time that we can let new oaks come up or manage the oaks so we can have some large oaks. And one thing we have to deal with is of course the overgrowth. That's a general problem in the oak landscape, at least here in Östergötland. And it's also important to secure the next generation of sun-exposed veteran trees. So not only taking care of these ones, but also protecting the new oak seedlings here. Because we have an enormous potential of the landscape here, and we know that with correct management and restoration we can save species in extinction depth. We made one study here just south of Linköping, and this is probability of occurrence. White areas have a very low probability of occurrence of a model species with 200 meters dispersal ability that use hollow oaks. And as you can see, you have a few areas here that are pinkish, and that means that you are up to 20% occurrence probability in the landscape. But what happens if we manage this landscape optimal and we manage also to put some new oaks between these areas? That gives an idea of the potential of the landscape. And then the landscape starts to look like this. So in many areas we have a huge potential if we manage it correctly. So by this slide I want to wrap this up, give you a few conservation strategies to take home, starting up with mapping valuable oak areas and general oak distribution. That is a super thing to start up with. If you can map some species occurrences, it's even better. Identify and map then important landscape regions with enough old oaks for long-term survival of species. I have given you the scales and the numbers. You can just go home, do it. Identify priority regions, of course, then with this. And make landscape management strategies with measurable goals. I think that is important. We know how many oaks, how large areas we would like to have. Do it. Try to involve landowners and different sectors in whole regions. We have oaks in forests, arable fields, everything. We don't want to see this. All right. Time for questions.
Great, thank you.